flame-spewing spears, weapons that could tear through shields, and ancient machines that looked like they came from the future. These are more ancient weapons so advanced they shouldn't have existed. Before anyone had firearms, the Song dynasty in China came up with something called the fire lance. It was a long spear with a hollow tube strapped to the front. At first they used bamboo for the tube, later on they switched to metal, but inside that tube they packed gunpowder along with bits of metal, rocks, and broken pottery, and when a soldier lit the powder, it fired this huge blast of flame, thick smoke, and nasty sharp trash right into the enemy's face. Now, it wasn't great at hitting specific targets far away. If you wanted to shoot someone from a distance, you still used a bow, but close up, this was terrifying. I mean, imagine charging into the battle with a spear, but right before you poke the guy in front of you, this massive explosion erupts right in your face. Not only would you be lucky to survive the blast, but if you are on horseback, good luck. Send your steed into a total panic. The fire lance changed fighting forever. For thousands of years, every weapon relied on human muscles to do the damage. Fire lance changed that by using chemical explosions to fight instead. And over time, people kept tweaking this very simple idea. They made the tube stronger, dropped the spear part, made the heavy pieces fit together tightly inside. That's how we got hand cannons and muskets, and eventually, of course, the firearms we have today. Back when Rome was starting to grow, they ran into a bit of an issue. They had to fight Carthage, the top power on the sea. Rome had a great army on land, but on the water, they were totally out of their depth, no pun intended. Carthage had better boats, experienced captains and sailors who lived on the water. In a normal sea battle, Rome was gonna lose. Instead of learning how to fight on sea overnight, Roman engineers got creative. They decided to stop playing Carthage's game and force Carthage to play theirs. They built a device called the Corvus. Corvus was a wooden bridge about 36 feet long, attached to a swivel pole on the front of Roman ships. Underneath the far end of the bridge was this heavy, sharp spike, looked a bit like a bird's beak, which is actually what Corvus means in Latin. When a Roman ship pulled up close to an enemy boat, they dropped the bridge, and that heavy metal spike slammed through the wooden deck of the enemy ship, locking the two boats together so nobody could pull away. That turned a sea battle into a land battle pretty quick. Roman soldiers would charge across the bridge, forcing the enemy to fight hand to hand. Carthage's sailors were great at steering boats, but they couldn't hold off trained Roman foot soldiers in a sword fight. If you ask anyone to draw a sword, they'll draw a straight piece of metal meant for swinging or stabbing straight ahead. Shields work really well against those because you just block the incoming hit. But warriors in ancient Ethiopia created a weapon called the Shotel, which had a long blade that curved in a big semicircle, looked like a giant hook. It looked weird, but that curve had a specific job, reaching right around an enemy's shield. When a fighter attacked with a normal sword, a shield easily stopped it. With a Shotel, the warrior swung the blade past the shield. The curved tip would reach behind the shield wall and hook into the opponent's back, neck, or ribs. The shield stayed intact, but the person holding it got hit. Using a Shotel was not easy though. You couldn't just swing it like a stick, or the point would curve back and hit you. It took years of practice to master the wrist movements needed to control the hooked tip, but in the hands of a skilled warrior, it was terrifying. Most ancient throwing weapons were pretty simple. You had spears, small darts, or throwing blades, but in ancient India, warriors came up with something completely different called the Chakram. A Chakram is a flat metal ring with a razor-sharp edge. The inside edge is smooth so you can hold it, but the outside is deadly. It was basically an ancient, highly dangerous metal frisbee. To throw it, a warrior would spin the ring around their index finger to build up speed and then flick their wrist to launch it. Sometimes they'd also just throw it. Very dangerous, not just for the enemy, but the wielder too, but it was effective. Flew straight through the air over pretty impressive distances. When it hit someone, the spinning edge sliced deep into the skin and bones. Some stories even say these things could chop off limbs. Sikh warriors became famous for using these, wearing multiple chakrams stacked on their tall turbans or slung over their arms. Building a chakram took serious skill though. Ancient blacksmiths had to make sure the circle was perfectly balanced. If one side was slightly heavier than the other, it would wobble in the air and miss the target completely. The Roman army was the toughest military force around. They had heavy helmets, strong body armor, and large rectangular shields that kept them safe from almost everything. But when Rome marched into Dacia, which is modern-day Romania, they ran into a weapon that scared them so badly they had to change their gear. The weapon was the Falx. was a massive curved blade attached to a long wooden handle swung using two hands. And unlike a curved blade where the sharp side is on the outside, the Falx had its sharp edge on the inside, like a giant tool for cutting tall grass. When a Dacian warrior swung the Falx, the heavy blade acted like a hook and an axe at the same time. The sharp point could catch the top of a Roman shield and yank it down, leaving the soldier completely wide open. If a warrior swung it hard enough, the point could chop straight through a Roman helmet or split a wooden shield in half with one blow. The injuries were so awful that Roman troops started panicking. Rome realized very quickly their normal gear was not enough. Before going back into Dacia, Roman generals forced their troops to upgrade. They added thick iron bars to the tops of their helmets so the Falx couldn't split their heads open. Hardly any weapon in history ever forced the Roman army to change its equipment like that, but the Falx did. Rapid-fire weapons are not a modern idea. Way back, around the 3rd century BCE, a Greek engineer named Dionysius of Alexandria built a machine called the Polybolos. The name means many thrower. Standard catapults back then had a big flaw. They were slow. A crew had to crank the string back, fire, and repeat the whole thing by hand. It took forever, and while you were reloading, the enemy was of course shooting back. This weapon fixed this with a smart system of gears and chains. It had a wooden box mounted on top that held a stack of wooden arrows. Underneath was a chain drive connected to a hand crank. All the operator had to do was keep turning that crank and pew pew pew. As long as someone kept cranking, another person kept dropping arrows into the box, the Polybolos kept shooting without stopping. It was too expensive and complicated to build in huge numbers, so it didn't replace standard weapons everywhere, but the design was way ahead of its time. Before cannons came along, castles were almost impossible to break into. You could sit inside one for months while an army outside starved, but then came the Trebuchet, and giant stone walls were a lot less safe. Earlier catapults used twisted ropes like bent wood to launch rocks, and they worked okay for small stones, but they didn't really have real power. The Trebuchet relied on heavy weights and gravity instead. They were built like a gigantic seesaw set on a high frame. On the short end of the long wooden beam, engineers hung a massive box filled with tons of rocks, dirt, or lead. On the long end, they attached a rope pouch holding a giant stone. To fire it, a crew pulled the long end down to the ground using ropes and winches, lifting the heavy box high into the air. When they pulled the trigger, that massive counterweight dropped. As the heavy box crashed down, the long end of the beam whipped upward at high speed. The pouch snapped forward at the top and launched the stone with crazy force. Huge trebuchets could throw 300-pound boulders hundreds of yards. When those stones hit a castle wall, the stone defenses would often crumble. During a war in the 2nd century BCE, Greek forces introduced a weird projectile weapon called the Kestros. It was a strange mix between a heavy arrow and a throwing dart launched using a sling. Normally, slingers threw small stones or lead balls, and they flew fast, but they mostly just bruised people or at best maybe break a bone. On the other hand, archers shot arrows that could pierce armor, but they didn't hit with much heavy force. The Kestros was the best of both worlds. The weapon was a heavy dart made of a solid metal point attached to a wooden stick, with wooden fins on the back to keep it straight. It was about 1.5 feet long. Instead of shooting it from a bow, soldiers used a modified leather sling made specifically to hold the shape of the dart. The slinger would spin the Kestros around their head to build up speed and let it fly. Ancient writers said these darts could punch right through wooden shields and thick body armor at really long ranges. We don't have many surviving examples today because the wood and thin metal rot away easily over time. Still, it was a clever way to blend the long range of a sling with the punch of a heavy dart. Trying to break into a walled city was a nightmare. Guards on top of the walls would rain down arrows, boiling liquids of various kinds, rocks and spears on anyone who came close. To get soldiers over or through those walls alive, ancient armies built massive wooden siege towers that carried battering rams inside. These were giant rolling wooden buildings on huge wheels, sometimes standing 5 to 8 stories tall. The outside of the tower was often covered in wet animal skins, metal plates, or thick mud, so it would be harder for the enemy to fire flaming arrows and set them on fire. On the ground floor, hidden under heavy wooden roofs, was a massive battering ram hanging from chains. Teams of men could swing the heavy tree trunk back and forth, smashing it into stone gates. At the same time, the top floors carried troops right up to the enemy's level. Soldiers climbed inside ladders to reach the top, totally protected the whole way up. Once the tower rolled up to the wall, workers dropped a wooden bridge from the top floor, letting dozens of troops run straight on the enemy defenses long before armored vehicles existed. That's been the video. I'll catch you, yes, you specifically, in the next one.